So thanks, and thank you, Thomas, for inviting me to speak. It's good to be back in New Haven, where I spent a number of years as a pharmaceutical executive for a while, and then at Yale University for a few years. I want to give you a little bit of background on Fair Access Medicines. I started Fair Access Medicines in 2014, so the end of 2014. And to take you back to that time, that was at the height of the Ebola crisis. And the world was shuddering about what was happening in Africa. I was reading, at the time, articles from various sources that were explaining how over many years before this outbreak, there were medicines being developed, there were vaccines, there were therapeutics that were under development in various laboratories like academic laboratories and other laboratories that ended up not going anywhere. And why didn't they go anywhere? Well, we have a pharmaceutical industry which I'll show you in a few minutes. We have a pharmaceutical industry in the world that is focused on one thing, that's profit. And their secondary interests are the interests of patients. And so with my background in biopharmaceuticals, I'm a biochemist by training. I worked for many years at several companies in the area of development and manufacturing of biopharmaceuticals, where I realized that there's a lot of power in this technology that could be used for good. And that's what Fair Access Medicines is about. So basically, our goals align with our strong belief that access to medicines is a fundamental human right. It's not a privilege. Our aim is to manufacture high-quality medicines, and these will be taken through regulatory processes, through standard regulatory processes at the FDA and EMA. And the idea is sort of the opposite, and that's to market these products at the lowest possible price. So our view is that we want to promote equal access to medicines for all people, and that includes her and this mom and her baby, and even these two. So this is a picture from outside the J.P. Morgan Healthcare Conference in San Francisco. And you can see these people are holding these placards, basically protesting a drug that Gilead brought out a couple of years ago that fights a very bad disease, Hepatitis C. Hepatitis C is, up to the introduction of this drug, was basically an incurable disease, and this drug has basically revolutionized treatment. But there's one difficulty that we have with this drug, Sovaldi. The price of this drug is $1,000 a pill. And so a 12-week set of treatments with Sovaldi will cost the healthcare system, and I'm talking about, healthcare companies like all these big insurance companies, it's going to cost them $84,000 to treat the disease. It's very effective. So, of course, Gilead's argument is, well, and the U.S. pharmaceutical industry's argument is, well, we can charge whatever we want for these drugs. And that's the way they operate. Just parenthetically, if you look into the development of Sovaldi was developed using taxpayer money. So the NIH supported the laboratory that developed this antiviral and brought it to a small company called Pharmacet, and then Pharmacet was sold to Gilead for $11 billion Gilead then recouped that $11 billion in 2 years of Sovaldi sales. This is kind of, I don't want to dwell on pharma, greed too much in this talk, but this is a table of pharmaceutical companies' revenues and income, and you can't read the whole thing, but basically the summary of this is that pharma spends 99% of their net income on share buybacks and dividends. So dividends reward long-term shareholders, and that's a good thing. That's part of our stock market system, is that long-term shareholders are rewarded for holding their stock. Share buybacks, however, do the exact opposite. Those promote stock selling, and those promote short-term sales. What they also promote is large executive salaries. So within these pharmaceutical companies, they collect large bonuses and stock awards based on the share price. So if you juice the share price by buying back your shares, you can get a windfall in your salary. This comes from Bill Lasnik. This is a very interesting group, the Institute for New Economic Thinking. And this paper, U.S. Pharma's Financialized Business Model, is a very good read if you're interested in the pharmaceutical industry and how they operate. Let me switch to another disease that's becoming a real problem, diabetes. It's the third leading cause of death worldwide now, and it's surpassed several other diseases on that list. The other things that happen besides death, according to the World Health Organization, the complications from diabetes can lead to heart attack, stroke, blindness, kidney failure, and lower limb amputation. 3/4 of diabetics live in underdeveloped countries. And this is increasing because of the importation of unhealthy foods, leading to an epidemic of obesity in countries. So it's a worldwide epidemic. Some more facts. Every 6 seconds, a person dies from diabetes worldwide. That's 5 million deaths per year. 1 in 11 adults worldwide in 2014 had diabetes. That's 415 million, up 400% from 1980. By 2040, 1 adult in 10, that's the projection, 642 million, will have diabetes, and that's an increase of 150% from today. And then finally, over 500,000 children worldwide have type 1 diabetes. So insulin was first used to treat diabetes in 1922, and it was actually the very first product produced by the biotechnology industry, which uses recombinant DNA to produce and inserts it into organisms, which then produce the drugs. So recombinant human insulin was introduced in 1982. Yet the cost of insulin in the US particularly has skyrocketed. And then restricted availability of insulin has led to an epidemic of mortality and morbidity in both our country and in the developing world. Thank you. So here's the graph. And you can see the exponential increase in prices over the past decade. This is very interesting. This came out yesterday from NBC News. Several probes target insulin drug pricing. So with the price of crucial diabetes drugs skyrocketing, at least 5 states and a federal prosecutor are demanding information from insulin manufacturers, et cetera, et cetera. And it goes on to say the insulin makers, these are the big three, Eli Lilly, Novo Nordisk, and Sanofi, and top pharmacy benefit manager CVS Health are targets in these state investigations. And several of the financial filings note that that federal prosecutors want information regarding specific insulins for specific dates and related to trade practices. So these prices have risen in lockstep, yet these companies claim that there is no collusion in price increases. So what is our mission? We want to become the first nonprofit pharmaceutical company. We don't know whether another one exists, but maybe yes, maybe no. Hopefully there'll be more coming around after we start. But we want to start a change. We want to introduce a paradigm shift in this model that technology is available to make these drugs. It shouldn't be restricted to people who can just afford the drugs. We need to get everybody on board with access to drugs. Our first target is going to be insulin, and we want to provide insulin at low cost. Our cost projections right now suggest that we can sell insulin at 10% or less of the current cost from the big three. So manufacturing, just briefly, manufacturing of these drugs is not the expensive part of the equation. It's the research that goes into discovering the drugs and other factors. And in the case, of course, of the big pharma companies, it's paying executives and so on. Okay, so where are we? So far, we've obtained a strain of yeast, and this is through one of our board members who is a pioneer in the production of proteins in a yeast called Pichia pastoris. Pichia pastoris is a relative of Saccharomyces, which is the yeast that's used to make bread and brew beer and so forth. But Pichia is really good at secreting proteins. So we're going to use Pichia to secrete insulin at high levels. So secondly, we've been granted pro bono access to laboratories at Bayer Pharmaceutical Company's collaborator facility in San Francisco, where I live. And it includes access to development equipment that's going to be necessary for the development of insulin. So with these two things in hand, we can develop a manufacturing process for insulin at small scale, and then using the expertise that we have, we can scale that up and contract manufacture it at many places around the world. And we've developed a 4-year financial model and timeline. The idea here is to evergreen our organization, meaning that we will be net revenue neutral, and that we will be able to sustainably produce both insulin and then go on to produce other drugs. So we have some other drugs targeted, one of which is Daraprim, which is the one that you all know about, that Martin Shkreli raised the price of by 500%. This is just to show you that we have a timeline that we're working on. This is kind of a simplified timeline, but we hope to initiate full-scale GMP manufacturing by the end of 2019 and go into production, then do regulatory filings in Q3 of 2019, and then FDA licensure. Our to-do list. Number one, we need to raise $700,000 to support the development effort. We're actively working on that. We have we live in a good area for fundraising. We have several billionaires and millionaires in the Bay Area, and we have some contacts in that space. So we hope to raise this money very soon. We're hoping to start our development work in December, 2 months. And that's it. I hope you can visit us at fairaccessmedicines.org. We're really looking forward to getting started on this effort, and I invite all of you and your friends and everybody else to look into this and see if you think it's a good idea, as we do. Thanks.
Thank you so much. I thought it was a wonderful presentation, and really excited about the project. You mentioned that in the developing world, one of the leading causes for the adoption of these chronic Western diseases is the adoption of a lot of the lifestyle habits of the West. And I was wondering, as a nonprofit, in addition to playing arbitrage with the folks on the curative side, which is great, and I'm very much in favor of that, perhaps there's less of a financial interest, no financial interest in telling consumers of your product, unlike pharmaceutical companies who have a vested interest in retaining people in this kind of pre-morbidity stage to have chronic kind of consumption of their medicine in order to extend profits, that by addressing some of the root factors of, highly processed food, the entire kind of adoption of the Western kind of lifestyle and diet, that by foregoing that and actually going back to some of the traditional kinds of habits and lifestyles, that they might actually avoid the kind of epidemic of heart disease and diabetes and some of the other kinds of maladies that we're confronting here.
Yeah, logically, that is the approach, that people need to be taught not to eat processed foods and not to eat junk food. That's the ultimate target. There's another part to that, of course, which is the type 1 diabetes, and that's unavoidable. But the type 2 diabetes, in many cases, is avoidable. And I don't know how many of you may have seen the article in the New York Times a few weeks ago about Nestle importing
Brazil.
Yeah, importing unhealthy foods to Brazil and then having people promote those foods. And Brazil has had a huge epidemic of obesity, and then the consequent increase in diabetes. And so, yeah, I agree with you totally. One other aspect of our effort that I neglected to mention is that we would like to eventually establish manufacturing facilities within the countries that we work. And so if we go to Africa and deliver medicines, it's one thing. So if we deliver insulin or we deliver other medicines to these countries, that's one way to help them, but a bigger way to help them would be to actually teach them how to do this. And we have people in our organization who are both, including myself, who are both educators and scientists. And we feel like that's one of the real long-term sustainable things that we can do for the underdeveloped world.
I have a question. Have you faced any resistance from those big three who might be problems with this?
We anticipate that we may encounter resistance. We are lucky enough to be represented by a very large legal firm in Silicon Valley called Wilson Sonsini, Goodrich and Rosati. They're a multinational legal entity, and one of the individuals on our board is Vern Norville, who leads their patent litigation group. And so we feel like we're very well placed to resist any efforts to put roadblocks in our way. There's no intellectual property limitations to us manufacturing insulin. The patents have all expired many years ago.
Yes, thanks. The first thing that comes to mind is the Gates Foundation and foundations of the like. Have you explored it? Have you explored your idea with them and their likes? Because that would be, I think, a very, there'd be a lot of synergies there.
Yes, we have talked to the Gates Foundation off and on. We've talked to several foundations actually about this effort. What I've learned is that when you're catalyzing a small effort, it's hard to get the interest of large organizations like the Gates Foundation. The Gates Foundation, there are a couple things. One is the Gates Foundation targets certain diseases. So they're targeting malaria, for instance, polio, river blindness. So they put tremendous focus on those disease areas. The other thing that I could say about the Gates Foundation in particular is that they have a lot of refugees from Big Pharma running their groups. And so when you have that mindset, then the go-to people are Big Pharma. So the Gates Foundation, uses Bristol Myers and other companies that manufacture the vaccines and drugs that they use. But I haven't ruled out, going back to the Gates Foundation after we prove that we're, really real and we can do something. Yeah. Yes.
Yes, I wanted to know, do you know anything about the biotech industry in Puerto Rico? Is it all dominated by American drug companies, or was the Puerto Rican government or any private sector Puerto Rican companies able to develop, property or influence within the biotechnology sector in that country? Because there was a time when biotechnology was big in Puerto Rico. I don't know what the status of it is.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I don't understand the entire picture, but I know that a number of companies went to Puerto Rico to set up offshore manufacturing in order to lower their taxes. So it was primarily, there was no, as far as I know, there was no R&D being done in Puerto Rico. It was purely manufacturing and for the primary purpose of lowering taxes. I think the tax law actually has changed since then, and some of those companies have abandoned their efforts in Puerto Rico. I know that Amgen actually, for instance, had a manufacturing facility in Puerto Rico.
Congress repealed that tax break.
Hey Jim, thanks. I don't know if you touched upon this, and the lady in the middle before asked us a related question. Yeah, better. So you have in place some legal strategies to protect yourself in case of roadblocks come along. That's what seems you were committing before. Do you have any more proactive strategies to include your competitors rather than just fend off their attacks and more, you know what I mean, just being more friendly and increase your legitimacy within the industry?
Yeah, I think Thomas and I have had a lot of discussions about, well, you don't want to, antagonize them too much. But I think that Bayer Pharmaceuticals is a good example. So they're a big pharmaceutical company, right? But they turned around and gave us pro bono access, and this went to their management. So their management knows we're a nonprofit. Of course, they don't make insulin, so we're not a competitor of theirs. But I think that's a good example, and I plan to, promote that relationship with Bayer, because I do think that eventually I mean, another long-term goal of mine is to sort of use this organization as an example to everyone that paradigm that, you know, that pharmaceuticals have to be expensive and that it's, you know, all this propaganda that you hear, that's not the case, that, you know, there's another way, and if we can be successful, then I think that will be a good way to demonstrate that to people and to governments.
Hi, thank you very much. So I know for some particular kinds of drugs, in example antibiotics, there's this kind of trade-off between access and development, because the pharmaceutical companies will argue, well, we need high prices because antibiotics may lose their efficacy due to resistance, and so to make back our research investment, we need to be able to set the prices. And so this proves kind of like a market failure, that there's just not incentive to develop some drugs because they lose profitability before the companies make back their investment. And so I was wondering, obviously, we both want accessible prices and we want the development of new drugs. I was wondering if you could speak to what are some efforts from governments or from larger bodies like the WHO to incentivize development of kind of otherwise underdeveloped drugs.
Yeah, I think for the most part, a lot of those initiatives come out of nonprofits like the Gates Foundation, of course. But I think the government of India, for instance, is very interested in treating the diseases of the undeveloped world, you know, in particular India, of course, and other governments, you know, I think are interested in doing these things. But one of the things is having the technology available and having people who are having the expertise to do these things. And it's a kind of a short list of people in the underdeveloped world who have the wherewithal and the knowledge to do that kind of work. So it's been really reliant on, as I say up to now, on the nonprofits and maybe some larger governments like India.
I am a doctor, so I'm not an academic. I'm not an activist. Doctors are pretty simple, as you'll see. I work for Partners in Health. That's a NGO. We're based in Boston. We are healthcare providers, and we have multiple projects in multiple countries, and we treat a lot of diseases. So this issue of access to medicines is a big one, not necessarily because it's a focus of our organization, but just because we can't get the medications. We need the medications to treat patients. So even though this is not my area of expertise, I wanted to talk a little bit. And I wanted to talk about one of the diseases that Jim just discussed, which was hepatitis C. It's a great case study of access to medicines, and that's something that's going on right now. In the past 5 years, the entire world has changed. So
turn the wireless off. You don't get the wrong thing.
And so this is a very, I don't know if you guys have ever seen this movie. This is 2013. It was actually very, very, very popular, I think. And Matthew McConaughey actually won an Oscar for this. So the story is, this is based on a true story of a man in the 1980s, I think it was around 1985. This is at the beginning of the HIV epidemic. He was a Texan living in Dallas, and he found out he had HIV. And so at that time, there was very little access to drugs. In fact, the first HIV medications were being developed. There was a lot of controversy, a lot of suspicion on the part of HIV patients. They didn't trust the FDA. They didn't understand why they couldn't get drugs that were currently in studies. So this guy was actually, he set up this thing called the Dallas Buyers Club. So he would get unproven drugs from Mexico. Some of them ended up being worthless. Some of them actually ended up being somewhat effective. He would bring them into the United States, and with this network of HIV-positive patients, he would distribute them. It was a real club. I think they would pay a certain number of $400 a month or per year or something like that to get a steady supply of drugs, and they would treat themselves outside the confines or outside the regulations of the regulatory structure, the FDA structure. This is a completely true story. Now, what is this? This is New York Times. This is dated July 25, 2017. The Tasmanian Hep C Buyers Club. It's amazing. If you haven't seen this article, you should read it. So this is a little different. So now, in the case of hepatitis C, remember what Jim was saying. The drugs are not unproven. These are actually well proven. They have gone through clinical trials. The problem is only access. Patients cannot access the drugs due to high prices. So we have this man, he was actually, Greg Jeffries was a hepatitis B patient in Australia, and he was able to find, he actually was unable to access these drugs. He found a source, and it was India. He treated himself, it was successful, and now he set up in an international buyers club of people who are trying to access these drugs from India, not even which is a poor country. In fact, the tables have really turned. So he, it's different now, right? It's different from back in 1985. There's the internet. You can click with Google. You can find this on the internet. You can write an email. You can get a response in 24 hours. It's really quite amazing. So just to explain a little bit, there was this is New York Times. This actually is on YouTube. This was a little program, a very, very short clip from BBC. Let's see if this happens.
I'm waiting for the results, for my end of treatment results. So she's going to fax them straight through to him, and then hopefully he'll get back to me.
Sean Redding, desperate and unable to get hepatitis C treatment within the healthcare system, has taken matters into his own hands. Millions worldwide face this dilemma. I've been making a film about access to treatment for the hepatitis C epidemic for over a year. I found out I had Hep C in 1998. It's highly contagious and can cause cirrhosis and liver cancer. Previously, treatment was very toxic. Now there are new drugs which cure with virtually no side effects. I live in Germany, where I was prescribed treatment with the new drug Harvoni. I am now cured. I've come back to the UK to find out why people here aren't receiving the same treatment as me. I'm starting with Dr. Andrew Hill, an expert in drug pricing.
If you look at the cost of these treatments, they're fundamentally cheap drugs. They cost £100 per course to make for 12 weeks of treatment for one person. That same treatment is being sold in the United Kingdom for £35,000. So it's just such a huge price that the National Health Service and NICE have been hesitating, they've been waiting to decide who should be treated first.
Yet, based on our investigation,
Dr. Hill told me about the US Senate's investigation into pricing, which is focused on one particular pharma company, Gilead.
Using Gilead's own documents, the evidence shows that the company pursued a calculated scheme for pricing and marketing its hepatitis C drug based on one goal: maximizing revenue regardless of the human consequences.
How many billions do they need to make before they start lowering their prices? These drugs are fundamentally cheap, but they're not being accessed by most people because the prices are so high.
One of the reasons there's so little protest about the high price of hepatitis C treatment is that patients are often stigmatized. I went back to see my old doctor to ask him about this stigma.
Being silent about hepatitis C is doing no one any favours. I think there is an incredible amount of stigma, and I think that stigma probably comes from the days of hepatitis C being labelled as a disease of intravenous drug use, and of intravenous drug use as not being a useful part of society.
I went to see Dr. Magdalena Harris, who is researching the experiences of people with hepatitis C. For them, a trip to the dentist is always complicated.
The issue of the last appointment, I've been hearing that for the last 10 years in conducting research for people living with hepatitis C, that I'm given the last appointment of the day by my dentist, which is absolutely unnecessary.
We need to destigmatise this and say this is an infection. It's no different from any other infection. It's an infection that people catch and that needs to be treated.
One person who hasn't been able to access NHS treatment is Zsuzsanna Snary. Recently diagnosed, her appointments keep getting postponed. She isn't sure how she was infected with hepatitis C. What's she planning to do about treatment?
I don't know what I should do really. I suppose, I've been trying to sign up with trials without any success. I know you can also get drugs from India, cheaper. I don't know.
Zsuzsanna's life and health are being badly affected because she isn't getting treatment.
10 years ago, when I had breast cancer and stopped the HRT, I was quite fit and well. And during the last 10 years, I have gradually got worse. My stamina has gone, my mobility has been drastically reduced, whereas before I could walk for hours without getting tired. Now I'm not able to walk at all. I use a mobility buggy outside.
Some people are taking treatment into their own hands and are finding answers online.
Buying drugs off the internet is a new thing. It's an emerging way of being treated. And one issue is, do you know that the medicine that you're buying is genuine?
All these places will give information for everybody on how to...
Sean Redding couldn't get treatment in Ireland. The Irish Health Service, like the NHS, can't afford to treat everyone. Online, he found the Australian-based Fix Hep C Buyers Club. Through them, he bought clinically tested generic drugs.
Fix Hep C Buyers Club? I became a member of the Buyers Club and had my appointment via Skype with Dr. Freeman. I sent him all my documentation from my blood test results from Ireland, and he said, yes, it's possible. If I come over to Australia, I can come to him, he can give them to me.
Sean paid about £750 for treatment that will cost the NHS around £35,000.
I have now completed 12 weeks of treatment last Sunday night. I went for my blood test on Monday. I am now waiting for my end of treatment results as we speak.
My GP, Dr. John Fleetwood in Dublin, is on the phone. He has the results of my end of treatment tests. And so, good afternoon, Dr. Fleetwood. a little bit apprehensive and nervous, but excited at the same time.
I think you should be excited about the Hepatitis C test negative.
Excellent. Johnny, that is brilliant news.
How do you feel?
There you go, yeah. You know, I've lived with hepatitis since 1980. That's 36 years.
In the UK, it is legal to get 3 months treatment delivered to your door. So, for those patients who can pay for it, the Online Buyers Club may be an option. But most will have to wait and see whether the NHS can afford to treat them.
This is billions of pounds in funding at a time that the NHS is in a very difficult financial situation. So it just doesn't seem feasible that we're going to be able to eliminate hepatitis C within the next 15 or even 20 years with prices this high. But we could. We definitely could if we could get these drugs at lower prices.
All right, that's a lot of information there. So I want to, let's step back just a little bit. What is hepatitis C? Hepatitis C is a huge epidemic. There isn't that much publicity about it, probably for some of the reasons that were discussed in this little clip. There is a lot of stigma about this because it has, you can see on the right there, unsafe injections, inadequate sterilization, medical equipment, blood transfusions, sexual transmission, but really what everybody thinks is IV drug use. But the numbers of patients that are infected with hepatitis C or suffering from hepatitis C is actually really staggering. There are more, and it says right there, this is from last year, 180 million people are infected. This is 4 to 5 times the number of HIV, people living with HIV. And most of these are in the developing countries. So in the United States, we have less than 2% of the population have hepatitis C. Most of these are in Northern Africa. Asia is a huge place where this is a major problem. And when I was in medical school and doing my residency, hepatitis C was very much feared among the doctors and nurses. It is actually transmitted through blood. So if you have a needle stick or an accident during surgery, we were more scared of this than we were of HIV, in fact. And you've got about a 20% chance that you'll clear it by yourself. If you're not in that 20%, then you've got an 80% chance of developing chronic liver disease that will eventually, over 10 or 20 years, progress to liver failure, liver cancer. This was, even when I was in residency 20 years ago, this was the most common reason for liver transplant, which is a horrible process by itself. So even though I said that this is a major problem really in the developing world, I mean, most of the cases are in the developing world. Only less than 2% of the population in the United States, but less than 2% of the population is almost 4 million people. And one of the things here, this also comes from the CDC, baby boomers account for 75% of those. So anybody here who's a baby boomer or older, we are recommending now that you all get tested whether or not you have symptoms or not. And really, again, there is this debate: why do all of these older people have hepatitis C? Were they all hippies and were using IV drugs during Woodstock? This is actually one thing that people, if you look on the internet, this is what they say. It has nothing to do with that. What it is that in the 1960s, they phased out the use of reusable, and that was all disposable. But before that, they would have metal, glass cylinders. They would disinfect these things. They would autoclave them and reuse them again. And hepatitis C, more than HIV, is very, very difficult to clean off. So that actually was the reason why all of these older Americans were infected many, many decades ago. And then there were other reasons why that epidemic and that infection, it was transmitted from person to person. So what I was saying, but 20 years ago, doctors and nurses were really scared of this incurable disease that is almost always fatal. And then it all changed in the past 5 years. Again, this is something that Jim was saying. See, back then, I mean, they didn't even know, even 1980s, that was the first time they even could detect it in blood. So up until the 1980s, whenever you were getting a blood transfusion, and there were a lot of blood transfusions, there was hepatitis C being transmitted and we didn't even know about it. Now finally, around in the 2000s, so this is around the time I was doing my residency, there was the first treatments. It was these very, very expensive, complicated treatments, interferon, some antivirals. These, if you were on treatment for 12 months, you could get about a 60% cure rate and just horrible side effects. I mean, the treatments were horrible. And then just 5 years ago, there was this avalanche of antivirals that were incredibly effective, completely oral, less and less side effects. And the side effects today are just almost nothing, and it's 12 weeks long, and boom, you are cured. 95% cure rate. Multiple pharmaceutical companies coming up with a simple cure for a deadly disease. And what's the best drug? The best drug is made by Gilead. So even though there are multiple drugs made by multiple companies, pretty much every single clinical trial, you need to have a regimen. You have to take 2 drugs. But almost every one of those excellent regimens, one of those drugs is Sovaldi. Okay? So Sovaldi was $84,000 in treatment. And you know how they got that? Because you have 12 weeks, 7 days, 1 pill a day. That's 84 pills. So every pill, just like Jim said, is $1,000. That was the initial price of Sovaldi. Now, huge moneymaker. So this is billions of dollars on the y-axis. So starting in 2014, 60% of Gilead's profits came from a single drug. So $15 billion, $20 billion, I don't know what it is now. This was back in 2015 or 2000 when they actually made this graph, but I think that this is probably even going up. So as soon as this happened, a lot of people in my area of work became very, very interested and very, very worried. As I said before, most of the hepatitis C patients are in developing countries. How are they going to afford? I mean, people in the UK and the United States can't even afford $84,000. So how is even insurance companies in the United States, the Blue Cross Blue Shield, they're freaking out about paying $84,000 for 4 million people. So immediately, again, learning from the HIV experience, a lot of organizations, a lot of activists and advocacy organizations kicked in. So I'm going to have some definitions for you. Number 1, TRIPS. This is the trade-related aspects of intellectual property rights. So this is the framework, the international framework that regulates all patents. And a patent means that your company has exclusive rights to sell this drug inside this particular country. So let's say Malaysia or India or whatever. So if you have a patent in that country, and you can't just say, oh, I have a patent in the United States. You have to do a patent in every single country. But nobody else can import that drug, can make that drug, can sell that drug except for you. That's a patent. So now, within TRIPS, however, they negotiated this, and so one thing is that voluntary licensing. And what is that? Now, as a pharmaceutical company that has a patent, I can voluntarily, on my own accord, I can say, okay, I'm going to let this other generic manufacturer, this other company, make my drug and sell it in whatever country or whatever set of countries that I want to. So that's called voluntary licensing. But then there's something else that was within TRIPS called compulsory licensing. And this was actually written into the TRIPS agreement. So the idea is that if there is a situation where there is a patent barrier, that drugs, there is a drug that is important for the public health of a country, the government can allow generic manufacturers within that country to make it. And in fact, in violation of the patent. So for the supply of the domestic market, and in fact, the government will have to pay royalties to the patent holder. So what is going on now with Gilead and hepatitis C treatment? And let's take that one drug, that very, very effective drug, Sovaldi. Okay. So this is from the Gilead website. So one thing is tiered pricing. So tiered pricing is really simple. Rich countries pay more than poor countries. So Gilead doesn't have to sell, maybe in the United States, they want to say, okay, it's $1,000 a pill, but it can be much, much less in another country where people are, or insurance companies there are unable to afford. So they say they look at the country's ability to pay, the disease burden, the treatment needs, and so they have a tiered pricing strategy that is in fact global. So here we have, for example, this is the top tier, right? So this is Northern Europe. And you can see, it's hard to see the price here, but of Sovaldi, we're talking 50,000 euros. We were talking in Germany, 43,000 euros. The UK is 45,000 euros. This is all in 2016, last year. And in response, the insurance companies of those, or say the National Health Services, depending on what sort of medical system they have, they've simply started to ration hepatitis C treatment. So if you don't have enough money to pay, for example, in Finland, the government doesn't have, or I'm not sure what, it probably is the government because it's more of a socialized medicine system. They don't have 51,000 euros to pay for everybody who has hepatitis C. So they say, oh, this is only restricted for the most severe cases, the most advanced cases, the ones who are about to go into liver failure and are about to die, they're going to get that first. So they make a waiting list. In the dark brown, you have people who are less, you also have waiting lists, but it's less restricted. So people who are less sick can also enter into treatment. So this is the way that the rich countries have dealt with the very, very high price of Sovaldi. And that's what, and you remember in the clip, that was what was going on with the woman from the UK. In UK, there is Sovaldi, you can get it, but she's not sick enough. She's not on her deathbed, so she needs to wait. She needs to wait another year, 2 years, 3 years, until she moves further down the waiting list, and then she'll get a chance to access that treatment. Now, one of the things that Gilead has done is voluntary licensing. This is very, very interesting. They have experience of this from what happened 10 years ago in HIV. It was a very, very similar situation, and it was really only patients in rich countries who were accessing HIV treatment. And poor countries were completely shut out. So you had country, they were selling it for $100,000 for a year, and that's just absolutely impossible for governments of very, very developing countries. So they've actually aggressively gone to do voluntary licensing. So they said, we're going to just open this up. If you're a generic manufacturer and you want to manufacture this drug, you can have the patent. We can give you everything. Exactly instructions on how to manufacture this drug. However, you can only do it in certain countries. And these are the countries where they know they're not interested in selling because the governments are simply too poor and the patients are too poor. They're not going to make any sort of real money on this. Now, they say actually, okay, they have to pay a royalty to do this, so Gilead is making a little bit of money, but I would guess, I'm certainly not close to anybody to any Gilead executives, but I'm guessing that royalty is extremely small compared to $15 to $20 billion a year that they're making in Europe and in the United States. So actually, I don't think that the motive here is profit. They're getting something a little bit, but it's really more about control. They want to give access to certain countries, but not to others where they can make more money. And this program has been actually very, very successful. So you have here all of the countries on the left where these voluntary, all of these 11 Indian generic manufacturers, they are absolutely prohibited from selling their product. So places like the United States, where it's about $64,000 for a 12-week treatment, or Switzerland or Lebanon. But really, even going down to middle-income countries like Turkey, Malaysia, Brazil, certainly they have different tiers. They have lower tiers of what they're charging for these much poorer countries, these middle-income countries, Malaysia, Brazil, Thailand, but significantly more expensive than the countries on the right. So really poor countries, let's say Pakistan, Egypt, India, Ivory Coast in Africa, they're paying $126,500 per treatment. And they're buying Indian generics. And in the middle, actually, in some of these countries, Gilead is also selling their drug. Their drug is registered, their brand name drug. But because there are Indian generics that are also being sold there that Gilead is allowing to be sold there through their voluntary licensing program, there's no way they're going to charge a patient in Egypt $64,000. They're charging a much more reasonable $744. Okay, and then now the last thing, which is compulsory licensing. So up until now, remember what I said before, compulsory licensing means that the government says, in this case, the Malaysian government says, you know what, there's a patent, but we're going to allow a Malaysian generic manufacturer, we're going to give them a license to manufacture and distribute and sell this particular drug, okay, outside of Gilead's patent. And this just happened a few days ago, and this is the first time that this is happening. And the backstory is that, if you recall, that Malaysia is actually right here. This is Malaysia. It's not supposed to be it's not in the voluntary licensing program, because Malaysia is a middle-income country, and there's a lot of people with hepatitis C, so Gilead probably thought, well, there's actually some money to be made here. And no matter how much they negotiated with the government, they couldn't get below $13,000 a treatment, which, for Malaysia is not a very, very poor country, but that's way higher than the per capita income of a Malaysian. So in the end, this is what the rumor is that the government basically stepped in and said, we've been negotiating this is not going to happen, we're going to do a compulsory license and we're going to get this drug in a different way. So that's very, very interesting. This is the first time this has happened, and a lot of activists are thinking, well, maybe this is going to put some more pressure on Gilead. They've certainly done a lot for the very, very poor countries, but there's a lot of middle-income countries which are shut out of the Indian generic market now. Maybe this is going to put some pressure on them to open that program up a little bit. And then there's other things that are going on too. This is, again, I think this happened a few days ago too. So here's an American nonprofit that just simply filed a suit. They're saying, no, we're going to challenge your patent. Again, this is way out of my area of expertise. But I think that the argument is, well, this is, Sovaldi is a slight modification of the existing drug that already had a patent. This should not have, the US Patent Office should not have granted this patent. Well, that's very, very interesting. I have no idea whether this is going to succeed, but as you can see, there's a lot of different organizations that are interested in the health, in the treatment of hepatitis C in developing countries, and so this is not a closed story. This story is ongoing. It'll be very interesting. A lot of things have happened just in the past 5 years, and it's going to be very interesting what happens in the next 5 years. Certainly, the health of millions of people is going to be dependent on what happens with this story. And so I want to end with this is a little excerpt from the New York Times article. And this is, I I thought this article was very, very well done. And this was a patient. This is a patient with hepatitis C who lived actually in Fort Worth, also in Texas. Elle Hurley, 39, from Fort Worth, found out she had hepatitis C in 2010 when she was pregnant with her second daughter. There was no cure at the time. In 2014, when she found out about Harvoni through a friend and anticipated getting the disease, it turned out that she was too early. So again, back then, in 2014, that was when the drugs first came out. There was very, very strict rationing of this drug, and because it was new and it was so expensive. And she couldn't afford the drugs. There's no way she could pay for them. I don't know anybody who could pay for $84,000 course of treatment, and Medicaid deemed her not sick enough to cover them. But when she came across the story of Jeffries online, she said, why not go to India? She'd always been fascinated by Mumbai. I could either take a leap of faith or die a miserable death, she said. After she landed in Mumbai in June 2016, she had medicine within 5 days. The bottles immediately went into the hotel safe before she called her family. I was crying and I told them I was coming home, she said. Hurley vividly remembers taking her first pill in the car when her husband picked her up from the airport. And 9 weeks after beginning treatment, the virus was undetected. It was the best day of my life. So I like this story because, we're all, especially in this particular conference, we're talking about the poor. But with this particular issue, the difference between the poor and the rich is really not as different as sometimes it is for other issues. We really are all linked. It really affects what goes up with the story. What happens next with Gilead and with this treatment is going to affect a lot of people, certainly millions of people in the developing world, but definitely billions of people here in the United States too. Thank you very much.
Dr. Sandel, thank you very much for an excellent presentation. My name is David Sack, and I've been practicing gastroenterology in the New England area for 40 years and treating hepatitis C. And I've had the opportunity to witness the evolution of the treatment from the early days when there was really nothing but interferon. And everything you say, I think summarizes it well. I'd like to make some additional observations. Number one, we shouldn't be distracted by the reprehensible behavior of drug companies from a larger issue, which is how do we pay for development of new drugs? And I think that's an important question. The first thing to consider is that there are a lot of externalities here. Drug manufacturing is not a free market. Drugs in this country are paid for by pharmacy benefits management companies, which are contracted by insurance companies. And this distorts the market tremendously. So the consumer doesn't see the price necessarily. The other factor is that patent law and the FDA have aligned things in such a way that drug companies can make a lot of money. And this is a political process. And it's not just the drug companies that are involved. In some ways, we probably should regard drug development and manufacturing the same way we regard power generation and the utilities. The utilities have, I think, a right to make a profit, a fair profit, to incentivize them to come out and put up the telephone poles, the electric transformers. At the same time, they shouldn't be holding us hostage to incredibly high prices to turn the lights on. And there are a lot of other models that one might posit for paying for new drugs. But the fact is we would not have a lot of new drugs. And I think Jim will bear me out here because he's familiar with one of these drugs that was basically incentivized because of the need for an orphan drug. And of course the drug company was charging unconscionable prices for that drug. But if there was no reward at all, we wouldn't have so long. And there's a lot of discussion about when do you use scarce resources at all. There are drugs that have superseded Sovaldi, as you all know, Clusa, among others. And some of the insurance companies are saying, well, you can't have Clusa or Sovaldi unless you have reached a certain stage in the evolution of your cirrhosis. And some people would argue, well, that's waiting until too late and we should be in the preventive phase. Others point out that not everybody does die from Hep C. Not all Hep C leads to cirrhosis. Not all cirrhosis leads to liver cancer. So these are very complex issues, and I think that it's good to be concerned about providing drugs at a reasonable cost, but we also have to be mindful that there are all kinds of other political issues that have to be addressed and worked for. And that's by no means, I don't know anything you can say much about what your organization is doing. And I by no means mean to minimize whether good works you're doing. But I think other people need to also work for.
I think that's, I think I would agree with everything that you're saying. The only thing I would add is that I think that things are very, very complicated in the United States for the reasons that you say. And in fact, ironically, they may be simpler in the developing world. And what we found, both with HIV, I would say both with HIV and with hepatitis C, is that the pharmaceutical companies are simply not interested in the developing world. In other words, they know they're not going to make any money off of this drug anyway in Pakistan. So does it really matter to them if there are generics that are being sold for 100 times or 1,000 times what they're sold for in the United States? And this is what I found very interesting about this case study. Actually, they don't really care. They're really more interested about protecting the American market or protecting the European market, which which actually then may make those markets those issues are more complicated. So to me, the story of the Buyers Club is really ironic, because you can have more access to these drugs in really poor countries because companies realize that what difference does it make if there are 1 million people who are taking it? Those people, you wouldn't, if they were trying to get into that market, they would make zero money anyway. So why not just license it out and cure lots of people and get a lot of good PR about it? And so you have this very strange situation. I don't know whether it's going to be permanent. I don't think it can be permanent. At some point it has to break down, where people are actually going to India to try to get drugs that were, so people in the United States are actually trying to go to India to get drugs, and they have more access there than they do in the United States.
Well, I think it was interesting about the price discrepancy between the first world and the third world. But even with the 10% price tag in a poorer country, that's still probably well beyond what a local resident can pay. And so I'm interested to hear a little bit about Partners in Health and what you are doing, if anything, about drug pricing or your distribution side.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. The price of hepatitis C drug or Sovaldi in Pakistan might be $150 or $200, but that still might be more than somebody with hepatitis C is making for their that's in their entire income. So then that's not really that helpful. In fact, you might say, well, $84,000 in the United States is kind of a reasonable price, because that's maybe 2 times the per capita income. 2 times the per capita income in Pakistan might be $300. So maybe actually this is completely logical. But that also it's a major problem. I think that there is, from a public health standpoint, we know that the faster that we can get treatment out there, then the faster that transmission will stop. When people are cured, they don't infect other people anymore. So there's a real urgency to treat as many people as possible. You are absolutely right, that doesn't solve the funding problem, because even if it's only costing $300 a patient, if you've got 1 million people, that's costing a lot more money than that government might be able to afford. But certainly, it's a step in the right direction to have cheap generics there and access for those drugs to be able to be bought in that country. And it's an ongoing battle to try to raise money. We try to raise money for all sorts of treatments in our hospitals and clinics, and there are much bigger pockets out there that are trying to. We're thinking about hepatitis C treatment and thinking about the best way to raise money for that too.
Yes, thank you. I just want to agree fully with Dr. Song regarding the pharmaceutical companies protecting the wealthy economies, markets, US, Western Europe, so on and so forth. That's where the drugs are, that's where the societies can afford them. Therefore, I encourage Jim to explore in the third world, because you want to have less resistance as opposed to opening up shop in, say, Belgium or France or the US for that matter. So there's a light at the end of the tunnel, by all means. But I also go back to what Dr. Song said about the mandatory licensing, and I find a huge challenge in that one, because it causes price arbitrage and profits that are illicit in Malaysia by the government or government representatives. So I can see clearly a lawsuit, a WTO approach to stop that practice. So I wouldn't call it something that's going to be prevalent. It's very tricky.
Comment that we are very concerned with both the U.S. and ex-U.S. So we're not limiting ourselves to either place. It does turn out that, of course, in the U.S. and in Europe, the prices are the highest, and that limits people's access to drugs. I mean, people who, diabetics are skipping insulin doses and things like that, and that leads to all kinds of bad consequences. And that's here in the U.S. People who can't afford, the cost. And so that's, there's a real need here, and there's a real need in the rest of the world too. The other comment I want to make is that I don't think anybody argues with the ability of pharmaceutical companies to make a profit. They're companies, and they have expenses. They have big expenses. There's no doubt about that. The thing that bothers me about these companies is what I put up on that, when I put up that table. They're buying back their shares. That money represents 3/4 of, if you take an aggregate for those 18 companies on that table, that represents 3/4 of the money they spend on R&D. So they could be using that money to, reinvest in their business and, invent new drugs, do more for patients. So I think, and their costs are totally opaque. So we don't know what they spend their money on, other than these share buybacks and dividends and so on. I mean, those are reported to the SEC, so we know that. But in terms of other, their costs, nobody knows what that is. But you can suspect, and it's borne out by these share repurchases, that they are enriching themselves to the detriment of patients. Thomas?
Yes.
So hepatitis C is a communicable disease, and as such, treatments are susceptible to the problem of increasing drug resistance, right? So that over time, resistance against any treatment might build up. And can you comment from your experience a little bit on how pricing and this entire system of how drugs are marketed affects the resistance problem? So does it make the problem worse to have these high prices? Does it make the problem worse if people travel and to some extent self-medicate and so forth? Can you comment on that?
The treatments are still very, very new. But my personal expertise is in drug-resistant tuberculosis, so I definitely know a lot about that infectious disease and treatments for that, and how, and so I'm asking myself the question, for that disease, does pricing affect the acquisition of resistance? I think it's, I don't think there's a clear relationship. You know, for me, the most obvious thing is that the drug development is really driven, it's driven by the size of the market in rich countries. And one of the problems that has happened in tuberculosis compared to hepatitis C or HIV is that rich people don't get tuberculosis anymore. So nobody's interested. So even though this is, you know, this is the biggest infectious killer in the entire world, it's all of the deaths are in poor countries. So you just don't have a sustainable, for example, in my particular expertise of multi-drug resistant tuberculosis, you may have thousands of patients in a single developing country, but in the entire United States, you're going to have 100 people. And 100 people, even if you charge $100,000 a treatment, which actually they do, it just isn't that much money. That's not a market, that's nothing, okay? So even though there are 180 million people with hepatitis C in the world, they're more interested in the 4 million people who have hepatitis C in the United States, or maybe a few other, 5 million people in Europe. But that's a big market. You can make money on that market. That's a worthwhile market to target for drug development. So to me, so one of the things that we're seeing in HIV is that as HIV is controlled in the United States and in Europe, there is less of an incentive to do more, to do drug development. New drugs are now required because now there's resistant HIV. But that pool of people, that market of people is getting smaller and smaller. The people that can really incentivize a pharmaceutical company. And so this is a big problem. And some people are predicting that HIV will go the way of tuberculosis and that drug development is going to really slow down for this particular reason.